Selydove has fallen. You may recall that's one of the cities I've been showing you on the map every time I do an update over the last 2 or 3 weeks, especially. And I've been showing you how the Russians had been moving up on the left and on the right, northern and southern flanks of the city. That they, instead of just pounding up the middle of it and these so-called meat wave tactics that the West loves to accuse Russia of attacking, instead they were using much more sophisticated tactics where they were moving along the flanks on either side, continuing to hit the city with all kinds of ammunition and weapons and drones and artillery fire, etc., until finally the Ukraine side recognized they were about to get cut off and withdrew their troops from it. So ironically, and Gary actually has found some footage of some of the city of Selydove. You can see that unlike, say, Bakhmut, which was completely obliterated, there's lots of damage, but a lot of these places are still in large part standing. And part of the reason for that is there's just not enough Ukraine troops. They're having so much difficulty manning all these different fronts that they've had. As a matter of fact, up in the Kursk area, that we've also been showing you about how that's been shrinking. Ukraine has actually launched some more local counterattacks inside there, as opposed to some of the other places, which doesn't make any sense why they're continuing to put so much effort into those locations. It doesn't make much sense because it's a lost, not losing, but a lost prospect there. They cannot hold that much longer. It doesn't do them any good. There's nothing strategic important about it. It's just more and more troops are continuing to lose. And because they have so much effort put into that northern part of the fight, then they don't have enough troops elsewhere. They don't have enough troops anyway to man the entire front line. I've seen this morning there were additional videos and reports that the Ukraine side is having incredible difficulty, not even recruiting, but basically press ganging people and taking them off the streets. There's reports in the Western press. The Wall Street Journal actually had a piece out this weekend talking about how the Ukraine side has been going into bars, into nightclubs, and just anything to find men of military age. There is also reports out of the Ukrainian media this morning that up to 100 of these recruiters, I forget if they have a name for it, but the guys who were charged with getting all these volunteers or so-called volunteers, up to 100 of them have been killed in the last several months because of the terror that they have invoked on the people and who are trying to get away. And sometimes they actually take the lives of some of these people. It's just heartbreaking to see why they ignore the reality so much of what's happening on the ground. But so Selydove was one of the major areas that fell, but it's not the only one. And as Military Summary pointed out in one of the sections of the southern part of the Eastern Front today, the pace is picking up everywhere.
It's very, very, very unexpected attack, as I understand. The Ukrainians, as I understand, didn't expect that the Russians do have this number of vehicles and armored vehicles, and I believe that Ukrainians still asking themselves the question where the Russians managed to get these vehicles, this number of vehicles, where the Russians managed to hide them, and how, what was the intelligence doing when the Russians were preparing before this breakthrough. Now, let's once again take a look at the changes on map since the beginning of this offensive operation. Once again, this is the situation on the 25th of October, right before the Russians began their full-scale offensive. This is the situation on the 26th. The Russians managed to take under control positions to the south of Novoukrainka. On the 27th of October, we start receiving updates about the Russian entering the village of Novoukrainka from the southwest, and the Russians enter Shakhtarska from the southeast. And on the 28th of October, the Russians already established control over at least 33% of the settlement of Novoukrainka, and the Russians established control over 10% of the village of Shakhtarska.
Now, what you can see in that report, and that's just from this morning, is that unlike, say, in the late spring and early summer, where Russia was still making progress, but it was measured in increments of hundreds of meters per day. But now then you see, and just depicted on that screen right there, you just saw in that particular battle, they're in some places making 2 to 5 kilometers per day. And when you look at the overall impact that they've had in all of these fronts, and I'm going to show you those in just a few minutes, you see that there's just no rational way that anyone would say the fight should continue on. And also Defense Politics Asia, whom we've had on our show before, actually pointed out another aspect of this that's also problematic for the Ukrainians, not just the specific territory lost, but why they lost it.
Given the tide of war, the speed of the Russian advance, and the seemingly unwillingness to stand and fight, I think the Ukrainians will just withdraw from Nova Ukrainka. However, this does not mean that the Ukrainians are not hitting back. They are still using drones, maybe artilleries, but their ground troops are just not holding the line, because they cannot fight the armored rush. The Russians are using mechanized attack, so the Ukrainians cannot hold a position.
See, there's a twin problem that's working against the Ukrainians. They don't have enough troops. The Russians do. The Ukraine side doesn't have enough equipment. The Russians do. And you see, continuing on, this has been the case from the very, very beginning of this war. The Ukrainian side is fighting with a great deal of valor and courage and tenacity. The soldiers are still willing to fight, even though some of these areas, really all of them are virtually unsustainable and they can't win. It's just a matter of how fast they're going to lose territory. Yet, for some reason, the Ukraine side continues to fight, even though it's a useless situation. But that's, on the one hand, you want to give credit to the Ukraine side, but on the other hand, courage in the wrong place is fatal, and it's permanent. Because you may, on the one hand, be tempted to say, well, we admire the courage and tenacity of the Ukraine side, continuing to push back even against this onslaught. But what's the net result of that? If they recognize the reality and just said, we're going to end this the best way we can, then the killing stops right then. All the men get to keep living. No more territory will be lost, depending on whatever happens in the negotiations. But by doing this path and keep going down this course of action, you're still going to lose territory. You're going to lose more territory, but now the men don't get to live. And Ukraine has suffered an incredible population bleed. I mean, they've lost, by many reports, possibly more than 10 million people have fled the country since the war began. 10 million. I don't think they only had like 40 something at the beginning. So 10 million, a full quarter of the population is gone. Likely will never come back. Maybe some will, but certainly not in large numbers, as most have resettled in other places and don't want to come back to a place that may end up having to be fight future battles in the future. But then there's also the extraordinary loss of again, it's hard to know what's true and what's not with these numbers. You've heard one of our viewers here and some of the earlier comments was asking about the issue about the Russian casualties that's been claimed by the Western side. The United States always says, 600,000 Russian casualties total. Don't really know if the numbers are correct or not. I have serious doubts that it is. It's not small, whatever it is, and that's by the Russian side. They openly admit that the numbers are tremendously high, potentially around 80 to 100,000 dead, maybe 200,000 to 300,000 more wounded. So the number's not small. It's just probably not as high as what our side is claiming. But the Ukraine casualties are potentially, who you listen to, potentially up to 1.5 million total killed and wounded. But whatever the number is, it's going to be higher than the Russian side, and it makes logic sense because Russia, as you're seeing play out right now before your eyes, has an overwhelming number of firepower, of equipment, and men. They have no shortage of any of those things. So naturally, they have more firepower to bring to bear per man, and they have more men to bring the firepower. So naturally, the Ukraine side is going to suffer more casualties. It's just logic that stands to reason. So the Ukraine side has more casualties, and they have fewer men from which to draw, and a dwindling willingness of anyone to do anything other than be forced into combat. And even that's got a caveat with it, because according to the Ukraine commanders, this is not Russian misinformation, but the Ukraine commanders through Western media are reporting that the desertion rate is astronomical. Many of these guys, once they get press gang to move to the front, refuse to follow orders. They're not going to attack. Others, they start an attack once and then flee. And then still others, as soon as they get to the front, before they've even been asked to fight, they flee and they just desert. And there's no telling where these guys, some of them are trying to get out of the country. Others are just hiding in the countryside, trying to get away from these recruiters that are trying to grab them. It's just a terrible situation. Meanwhile, on the Russian side, because they have a lot of patriotism on their own, because they view this as an existential fight, they're having no shortage of people volunteering. Russia hasn't had to resort to a forced mobilization. They haven't had to resort to people grabbing Russian people off the streets, because there's still a lot of them willing to come in, reportedly between 30 and 40,000 every month, which is more than enough to offset the losses that the Russians have. Whatever that high number is, they're still coming in. So you see everywhere you look that there is no hope for the Ukraine side. And let me just graphically show you what this looks like on the map. Thanks for showing that on the screen there, Gary. This is from the Institute for the Study of War. And again, as I pointed every time I point these up there, the analysis by the ISW is horrific. It's terrible. But in terms of mapping, it's very, very accurate. And so this is what you're seeing on the screen right here. This is the Kursk operation, which I told you about. The blue is where the Ukraine side is. The red is where the Russians are. And you see this is continuing to shrink. And now it's this small thing right here. There's another pocket right up in here where the Ukraine side is at risk of being completely cut off. And then they could lose hundreds, if not thousands, of troops in this area. And there's just no point in it. Yet they continue fighting in there, and they've tried a couple of offensive operations over here on the eastern side of this oblast here. But then you just go down through some of the other things. And one of the things you're going to notice here, all these little green circles you see, this is where recent combat action has been going on. And these, I guess it's yellow or orange sections, this is where Russia has made advances. And what you're going to notice on every one of these maps, all these areas are Russian advances moving to the west. This is up in the Kupiansk area. Down here is in the area of the around Donetsk. Again, everywhere it's Seversk, the Pokrovsk area. This is Pokrovsk here. This is this big one we've been showing you for a long time now. This is where Selydove was. We'll get a better picture of that in just a second. But all of them are moving in the direction of the Russians. And this is Chasiv Yar. It's slow, but it's continuing to be the Russians. In fact, the only one, this one here, Toretsk, this is one of the few places. Now, this is where Russia has made advances over the last several weeks. But this is the only area where a local counterattack by the Ukraine side actually had some success and drove Russia out of part of the city of Toretsk, but only part of it. And it's a temporary situation because the Ukraine doesn't have the resources, manpower, ammunition, or weapons to reverse it. But everywhere else on this map, and you can just see as I continue to roll down through it, every bit of this is on the Russian advance. Now, you might think, okay, well, any rational person would say, you know what? This is just not going to work. And as a matter of fact, Gary, if you can put that other map that I have up there, this is another in the southern part of the Eastern Front. There is a major cauldron that's forming that has potentially up to tens of thousands of Ukraine's troops in here. And the area you're looking at is in the southern front. And at the very top of that, you see a kind of an X through the little blue area. That's Selydove. That's the one we told you about at the beginning that has fallen. And then all these others, Karakova in the middle by that little, you can see kind of a lake in the middle center there. And then all these others we see where an X is across. Those are places that Russia has recently captured. It's not just Selydove. They continue to take village after village after village. And now then it appears that Russia is moving in the direction of these where that circle there and the kind of the left side and the arrows between, those were the expected areas of the next Russian onslaught, to be able to close off all this area where they might not even have to fight, but just capture all these Ukrainian troops in there. Now, you would think that with this extraordinary amount of losses that the Ukraine side has, both personnel and now territory, that the end is clearly visible, and that any rational person would say, okay, we did our best. It's time to recognize reality and just bring this to a merciful conclusions under the best terms that we can get, because it doesn't make any sense to do anything else. That's what a rational person would do. But there are not many rational people in the West in positions of authority, or in Ukraine for that matter. And here is Admiral Stavridis, who recently did his best version of ignoring reality.
These troops, which are currently training in Russia, will hit the front lines. I've seen numbers estimated between 3,000 and 12,000. It's a significant military addition to the forces of Russia, who are losing so many. And final thought on this, Jessica, in the midst of worrying about it, as we should appropriately, we also ought to reflect that this reflects Russian weakness. Believe me, Vladimir Putin doesn't like the image of him going on bended knee to Kim Jong-un to get troops to keep his offensive going.
So he was talking there on the news about the report that some number of thousands of North Korean soldiers had entered the war, or were training with Russians and potentially were going to enter the war. And of course, Stavridis, who's a former Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, so a former 4-star admiral, you would think that he should be one of the smarter guys in the room when it comes to understanding the concepts of war and the fundamentals of what goes into making combat power at the national level, and would be the first one to say, this ain't going to work. But you see, instead, he just mocks and derides Russia and said, oh, this is an example of Russian weakness. Did you see anything weakness on that map I showed you? You see from the north up in the Kursk area, all the way around through Kharkiv, all the way through Kupiansk, everywhere down, all the way down to the Zaporizhia area, everywhere, it's nothing but Russian advances. You see that there are a number of pockets, both in Kursk and in the southern part, which I showed you a second ago. All of these are increasing risk to the Ukraine troops. You saw the video we just showed you that the Ukraine side doesn't have either the equipment or the personnel to handle any of these, and that's why they're moving back. And then you have this guy, this alleged, not alleged, he was a 4-star flag officer, an alleged smart guy, is sitting there telling you that's evidence of Russian weakness. What in God's name would he call it if it was happening in the opposite direction? What does strength look like if losing territory equals weakness, or losing territory for the Ukraine side? Does he call that strength? If Russia advancing is weakness, then is it the Orwell still at work? And is he going to call that actually strength? I mean, it defies any kind of logic at all. And one wonders why some of these mainstream media people who are doing the interview, why don't they ask him that? Why don't they say, Admiral, that's an interesting definition and analysis. Can you square that with what we see on the ground? Because we see the opposite on there. But instead, they just give him the mic and let him talk and just move on to the next question. It's really kind of discouraging. And it would just be annoying if it didn't have so much consequence, that so many people are continuing to die, leaving alive the possibility that this thing continues to escalate. And if you think that's an overestimation and an alarmist kind of view that's not borne out on the facts, let's look at what else is happening. So unfortunately, our guys in the United States are not the only ones that are acting irrationally. It's also senior leaders in the United Kingdom. Here is, this is just a couple of days ago. This is by Grant Shapps, former Minister of Defense for the Ukraine, for the UK. And he's saying, hey, man, we cannot let Ukraine fall, because, and then he's going to bring out another straw man argument. My God, if we don't stop him here, then Xi Jinping of China is going to move on Taiwan. We owe it to everybody. And what he says there, I have that call out there in the left, in case you can't read that. It says, now is therefore the time not only to provide long-range permission for our Storm Shadow missiles to Ukraine, but to do so without awaiting a decision from Washington. They don't want to be our poodle anymore. Just give them the long-range stuff. We should go further by doubling our defense support to Ukraine, doubling, despite the expense of restocking ammunition, while challenging the rest of NATO and other civilized countries to follow. The cost is nothing compared with the potential ruinous impact of a full-scale conflict between China and Taiwan. Again, folks, I'm sorry for those. I know we have a lot of UK viewers here. That's just delusional. That is detached from reality. First of all, just on the top level of it, where he's talking about like Xi Jinping is watching this with bated breath, and after 2.5 years of war, actually closing in closer to 3 now, that somehow he's going to wait and see how this one ends, and then if it doesn't end good for the Western side, then he's going to invade Taiwan. That's just, sorry, this is as polite as I can say, that's stupid. I mean, is he really that ignorant that he doesn't understand how nations go to war and what their calculations are? Or is he intentionally manipulative and knowing that that's just a red herring, that that's something that's an emotional issue and I want to try to extort you or convince you and manipulate you? He's trying to manipulate you into thinking, oh, alarm, we have to do this. Otherwise, something bad would happen somewhere else. Xi Jinping is going to make his determination exclusively on the conditions that exist in the Indo-Pacific region. He's going to primarily make it on what his calculations are about how he could or couldn't get along with fighting the United States, what the cost would be, what the benefit would be. And he's constantly reevaluating that. And if he thinks that using military force is better than not using military force, then that's where they'll move. And the more he calculates that, well, even if we could physically do it, the cost would be so high and what we would gain wouldn't be enough, etc. That's what any rational thinking person uses when they decide whether they're going to go into war or not. But you see that Grant Shapp doesn't want to do what's a rational analysis. He's just trying to manipulate you by making you think that's what we should do. And what's more dangerous is he's actually advocating action on the government, the current UK government, to say, hey, you know what? Forget about the threats coming from Putin or anybody else. Let's give them permission to use long-range weapons and double the stuff that we're giving them. Oblivious to two things. The second one I'm going to show you in a second, which is the potential response from Putin. But first of all, just look at the first one. As I have now shown you conclusively here, I do it all the time, but we've now reiterated it here. It's a manpower issue for the Ukraine side. They don't have enough men. Even if you gave them more and more ammunition, they don't have enough men to wage the war. Russia does. Russia has the men, ammunition, and the weapons that it needs. It has the industrial capacity to provide all it's going to need for indefinitely, as far into the future as we can count, much longer than Ukraine would ever have. Ukraine doesn't have it. Even if you doubled it, with all due respect to the history of the United Kingdom, even if they doubled what they had, it's still going to be a minuscule amount. It's not going to change that much in the bigger scheme of things. Bear in mind that according to a South Korean diplomat I spoke to recently, 8 million artillery shells total of all the different calibers have come from North Korea alone to Russia, on top of the between 3 and 4 million they produce annually on their own, plus whatever they get from Iran. So when you talk about the scale, even if UK doubled it, it's going to be minuscule in compared to the overall balance of weapons and ammunition between the two sides. So that's irrational. But then the second thing is what would happen with Putin is Gary showing you there. And there was a comment earlier today from Vladimir Putin. Gary, if you could toss that other one up there that had, I think it's got a call out on it, where Putin is saying that our military command is ready and is already ready if we have to fight NATO. You give permission for those long-range weapons, there's going to be consequences. According to this report here, Russian President Vladimir Putin issued another stern warning to NATO over the potential of Ukraine utilizing Western long-range missiles to strike Russian territory. According to Putin, if NATO consents to these strikes, it would lead to a direct escalation and could mean open conflict between Russia and NATO, fundamentally altering the dynamics of the war. Now, why would anyone in the West want to risk that? When you see the fundamentals that go into making combat power are irrevocably and decisively against the Ukraine side, why then would I want to risk escalating the war to include us, to get our people killed, to potentially go into a nuclear escalation? It's not just irrational, it's outright dangerous. that these kinds of people are in charge and making these kinds of advocates. I don't know if again, they're just word playing here and they're trying to say, we just want to use this to make something else happen to our benefit, but we would never really do that. I don't know. I almost hope that it's that kind of deception and lying, that because otherwise, if they actually mean what they're saying, and then they do want to keep throwing in more and more ammunition and accelerate into a new category where they're directly striking into Russia. And it's true. It's true. It's been admitted by even the Pentagon. If you use Storm Shadow missiles or American ATACMS, any of those kinds of high-end American weapons, they're Western weapons, and the Storm Shadows also, by the way, has a number of components that need American support. You fire those into there and there's going to be a response, because you can't do it unless you have British and American soldiers physically participating and getting those missiles on target. Russia has made it clear that they recognize that and that they would recognize that as direct participation, as would we if the same thing was happening to us in some other theater. Let's say in the Middle East. Let's say that if Israel and Iran actually came to blows and it turned into a war, not just a couple of missile exchanges. And then Iran said, okay, because the U.S. is helping you guys, we're going to attack the U.S. troops there, and they use help from Russia. What do you think it would do if it said Russian Iskander missiles blows up an American base in the Middle East? You think we'll say, well, that's unfortunate, but hey, that is a war, so that's just what they do. Of course not. We would lose our minds. We would go crazy. We would be demanding immediate retaliation, and there'd be this specter of nuclear war right away. And yet these people are so irrational and have lost touch with reality to the point to where they're oblivious to what would happen if we go through with what they're suggesting here. And then now you look at Schultz. Schultz from Germany is another one. He's almost. I think he's trying to I guess thread the needle here on doing some things that make some sense, but also not paying attention to the reality too much, because he doesn't want to get too far afield, where he has offered 1.4 billion euros in additional fresh military aid to Zelensky during a visit he just came to try and share what is the so-called victory plan. But then at the same time, he says, we're not going to let you use any of our long-range weapons. And then he also said one of the core portions of Zelensky's claim to his victory plan is that he wants to be in NATO now. You remember we've talked about that when he gave to his parliament, Zelensky did, when he made that statement about what it was. And the leading right off the top was he wanted this, he wanted NATO to be given an invitation to Ukraine. Schultz said, no, that ain't going to happen. So that's the one thing he said that was true. But then you see it's kind of a double side. He doesn't want to anger too many people, so he puts that in there. But then, of course, you got others like Orban from Hungary and Fico from Slovakia, even the guy from Turkey. Sorry, just went blank on his Erdogan. They're all opposed to that. There's many others. They would never vote for NATO. Then why are we even talking about it? I just don't understand why we want to talk about those kinds of things that everybody knows is not going to happen, because for NATO to be expanded, you have to have all 32 members agree to it, and they won't. I'm not even sure. I actually am pretty sure the U.S. would not do that. We would be one of those who's not going to vote to bring somebody who's at war into the NATO alliance and give them an Article 5 guarantee. Even if somehow you got this to some kind of conclusion, it would be insane to give whatever's left, whatever rump, a NATO membership and an Article 5, because that's the whole reason there was war in the first place. So we just keep going down these ridiculous paths here. And one more I want to show, because apparently the U.S. and the West and Europe aren't the only ones that have lost their minds. It's also the senior leadership of Ukraine. So here, Andrei Yermak, one of the senior advisors for President Zelensky, have this is just bizarre. They set firm preconditions for peace talks with Russia, as though they're the ones that are begging Russia to come, or that they're the ones that are setting the standards, and that Russia has to come begging for terms. And Andrei Yermak, the head of the office of the president of Ukraine, stated that Ukraine has taken a firm stance against any freezing of the current war, stating that the key precondition for initiating negotiations with Russia is the complete withdrawal of Russian forces to positions they held before February 2022. Now, that is the high, especially given what I just showed you on all these maps, all these cities that are being lost and fallen one after another, and the territory that is continuing to be lost, and the number of their troops that continue to die. And he's actually trying to talk like from a position of strength, that he's actually saying, all right, we'll talk, but only if you do everything we ask and only if all of you leave. I mean, that deserves full ridicule by everyone. And unfortunately, you get people talk about this and you see headlines and they just report it. Very few in the West say this is as detached from reality as it can possibly be. You're in no position to demand anything. And let me tell you something. It's maybe an eye-rolling thing here and a point of embarrassment, but there's the consequences to this. Because the Russian side sees we've been offering negotiated settlements all the way through, from before the war happened, right after it started, all the way through to last June, and even now they still give certain things that they can offer. But the cost is progressively higher. Every time they reject it, it goes higher. When the Russian side hears them saying this, when they hear some people saying we still want to get into NATO, all you do is tell Russia there's no point in negotiations. There's no point in talking to anyone in the West or in Kiev. The only thing that makes any sense is just to keep going with fighting until you take on the battlefield through force of arms exactly what you want to get your end state, which is security, which is no NATO in Ukraine. So we're providing incentive for Russia to keep fighting and to keep killing Ukrainians. Do you understand that? Do you realize that? That is the net. I don't care what anybody wants. I don't care what they wish were the case. I'm telling you what is the case. Ukraine and the West, Schultz, Keir Starmer and Joe Biden, our Secretary of State, Defense, all these people, you are getting Ukrainian people killed. You are creating the conditions that are going to get more Ukrainians killed. If it is 1.5 million, that's just the title so far, the total so far. It's going to get worse because you will not see reality. Now, many of you, sarcastically enough and embarrassingly enough, don't care. It's not British people that are dying. It's not American people that are dying. And Russian troops are still dying. So, okay. Hey, if Ukraine wants to keep fighting, why not? Just give them some more stuff. That is horrifically immoral, and it's also strategically stupid to the highest order, because you're leading to a condition. If you don't care about the Ukrainian people, that's a shame on you, but it's also bad for our country, because you are creating the conditions, you are setting things up for a condition to where at some point, even if Russia stays on this methodical move here, and it's 1 to 2 to 5 kilometers per day, and it takes another 6 months, 8 months, 9 months. Eventually, the Ukraine army will literally be ground to dust. They physically won't have enough people, and it's inevitable that at some point the Ukraine side will just collapse. And then you have created the conditions to where everything NATO could muster for probably more than 3 years at that point will have been utterly failed. Now, when the rest of the world sees like this emergence of BRICS, and we've been talking a lot about that lately, this meeting they just held. So the ground is already shifting internationally. Now, when the rest of the world sees that the best the West could do militarily, after bragging about how they're the most powerful military force in the history of the world, that we've said about ourselves in the United States, and that the NATO alliance itself is the most extraordinary, powerful alliance in the history of the world. If they see that completely fail, and if they see everything they did utterly turned to dust, and the Russian side, far from being weakened, ends up being strengthened, how do you think that's going to play? All the rest of the people around the world are going to say, okay, not only is your economic system starting to wobble and be unreliable, these guys keep talking about peace. They want to end all these wars. They want to prevent war, and even in the Indo-Pacific. China has said they don't want to go to war to take Taiwan, and they haven't since 1949. But they said that if they're moving towards independence and we keep facilitating that, they may, but they don't want to. And in all these other places, they are actively advocating for peace in the Middle East and in the Russia-Ukraine war. Even though China is joined at the hip economically with Russia, they still are saying, get this war over. Let's get the thing done. Let's get some kind of negotiated settlement. They don't want things to be solved by force of arms. And the rest of the people around the world are saying, okay, the people who say, let's solve things diplomatically and through talks are providing economic stability. Let's go with them, because everything the West is doing is falling apart. So don't you see, not only is this unethical and immoral about not caring about the people of Ukraine and objectively blinding our eyes to what's actually happening on the ground, we're also harming our own medium and long-term interest as well, and setting up a potential situation in the coming months to where we may have to come to the grips to where there won't be enough spin in all the world to hide this from even the most ardent Europeanist and American, pro-American people, that you lost the war, because there won't be a Ukraine army left to fight it anymore. And then all these other consequences, and you'll be faced with either finally acknowledging it or escalating. And then that's when we get the potential for nuclear war. And with that warning I just put up there a minute ago from Putin earlier today, he seems to be very cognizant of that. And he's warning, if you take that move, if you take that action, he's already mentally prepared to respond. And we are even more fools than I thought if we ignore that and say he's just bluffing. There's no reason for him to bluff. And there's every reason for us to take that seriously and to stop being stupid. That's exactly the situation here, folks. That's where we are. And we'll keep on top of this for you. We're going to keep bringing you the truth, because we're unintimidated and uncompromised. And even when it's bad for our side, I'm going to tell you the truth, in the hopes that enough of us get the truth out there that we can maybe bring some pressure onto our leaders, even in this 11th hour, to try and do something that makes a little sense, and eat a little crow if necessary, but make sure that we preserve our strength and our future ability to prosper as a people. That's what we're hoping for. Thank you very much. Please be sure to like and subscribe before you leave today. And always one of our fan faves, Larry the Shirt Johnson, will be on this afternoon to give us his take on some of the things happening in the Middle East. Thanks very much, and I'll see you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.